Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Levinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be collaborating with our friends at the New York Review of Books for tonight's event, Poetry in a Time of Crisis, featuring Dan Chiasson, Angie Mlinko, Francine J. Harris, Ishion Hutchinson, and hosted by Jana Prikryl. While the pandemic has taken a toll on in-person events, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become the lifeblood of our industry. And I wanted to give a huge thanks to all of tonight's authors for joining us for such a special evening. So, to some housekeeping before we get started. You should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have a question, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of your screen to submit. We'll try to get through as many of those as we can at the end of the program. You'll also find a chat button here at the bottom of the screen where I'll be posting links to purchase tonight's books by tonight's presenters, as well as a donations link to support our ongoing virtual programming during the pandemic, if you'd like. A caveat for tonight's event and for all of our virtual events, we are all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please do bear with any technical issues that could arise. We'll try to solve them quickly. And we'll be continuing our virtual event series through the fall, so please head over to our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. Our NYRB Classic series picks back up next Thursday with Edwin Frank and Madeline Schwartz discussing Anna Seger's classic novel, Transit. And we'll be carrying on our New York Review panel series, like the one tonight, across the coming seasons. So be on the lookout for more information about our next iteration. So now with the housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to hand things over to our host for further introductions. Jana Prikryl, a senior editor and the poetry editor at the New York Review, has written 2 books of poems, The After Party and No Matter. So Jana, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Hal. And welcome, everybody. I want to thank Hal and everyone at the Community Bookstore for hosting this event and organizing us all so seamlessly despite the world historical circumstances that are confining us to our homes. We called this reading Poetry in a Time of Crisis for obvious reasons. So far, more than 6 million Americans have tested positive for COVID and more than 180,000 have died. The police killing of George Floyd on May 25th in Minneapolis, following the deaths of many Black Americans at the hands of police officers, has led to what feels like a national awakening. The protests to affirm that Black Lives Matter have been thrilling and inspiring to watch this summer, even as they've been met with armed counter-protesters and violent attacks in many parts of the country. This is not to mention global warming ticking away to a point of no return, or the devastating economic impact that COVID has had on especially the most vulnerable Americans, and by extension on a whole generation of children. Some of us in the last few months may have felt driven back to the sources of our belief in equality and mutual respect. Poetry is among these sources, not because it's some special preserve of virtue, but because a good poem is at least the record of a person's attempt to recreate an authentic language outside of exhausted phrases and received notions and at times even tribal loyalty. Poems are a direct conduit to an individual voice, a mind that stands alone and is responsible for its own values. And in the end, I think poets depend on times of crisis to galvanize their work. The New York Review of Books has been publishing poems since its first issue in February 1963, and responding to crises, especially political and social ones, has always been central to the poems in our pages. It's a huge privilege for me to be here tonight with Dan Chiasson, Francine J. Harris, Ishion Hutchinson, and Angie Malinko, 4 powerful and very distinct voices. Tonight, they're each going to read a poem by another poet living through a critical moment, as well as their own work. And we'll begin tonight with Francine J. Harris. Harris is the author of 3 books of poems: Allegiance, a finalist for the Kate Tufts Discovery and Pen Open Book Awards; Play Dead, which won the Lambda Literary and Audre Lorde Awards and was a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award; and her latest book, Here is the Sweet Hand, which came out just a few weeks ago. We were very proud to publish 2 poems from Here is the Sweet Hand in the New York Review this summer. It is a book of great power and weirdness, finding a new language for human consciousness by fusing the ineffable qualities of thought and memory with the raw surfaces and sensations of the body. Like all four of our poets tonight, Harris's voice has tremendous coherence through all of her books. It is instantly recognizable in its syntax and textures, and this new volume seems to distill her ability to be both direct and strangely elusive as most actual experiences are. Harris was born in Detroit and has received fellowships from, among others, the National Endowment for the Arts and the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library. She is an associate professor of English at the University of Houston, so she's joining us, I believe, from Texas tonight. Hello, Francine.
Thank you for pulling this all together, and thank you to Community Bookstore for having us. I am reading, I guess I think maybe since I'm the first reader, I should say that we all kind of decided to read something from our own work and something from someone else as a way to kind of contextualize our conversation. So I thought I normally would read something different than what I published, but I keep thinking about it. I keep thinking in the context of this conversation, I keep thinking about the poem that I published with the New York Review of Books. So I thought I would read that. So I'm just gonna read that poem and another poem, and then pass the Zoom. So the poem that I published with you guys is called "It Is a Choice Because Kanye." And it's originated from Kanye West talking about essentially talking about the numbers of slaves and saying that it must have been a choice. Anyway, so that's partly why I keep thinking about it, because I feel like it has a lot to do with where this conversation I suspect will lead. It is a choice. The rapper chooses his vacancies. Room does not choose the rapper. The rapper walked into rooms, or were dragged into rooms. We're dragged into rooms, or we walked into rooms. The seating charts of airplanes look like the mill passage. Then we boarded the plane. Were dragged onto the plane. The plane was dragged from us. Much like the grocery store at night, where in drag, the lights of we dislocate. We remove ourselves from the store by cuffed security. If we are a being, then lightning has struck. We stand in the rain. The lightning is big, the oppressive sky. It stood us in wet, between the door and between the body. The mind is a template at the end of his gun. I brought my temple to his barrel and bliss. His gun did flips. His gun was loving. He was the kind of master who didn't trigger. We was the body beneath all that. My body got quite beneath them. They dragged their bodies onto mine. We opened all mouths to talk, genitals shackling black over black in the temple of take, the supine divinity, the slave ship dance. The choice couldn't be, dear prophet of rap, a choice against monster or its poison tip. The slave is a dance and a rope stood still in its choice of whip, its choice of lynch orifice to swallow its sawed-off dick, which pinkish meat, flesh devourer, which exit to design, which disemboweled master, a stand which stood, was still or removed each larynx, withstood machete each bludgeon become, to fight with clarity is a kind of abstraction, a tongue its cruelty. Eternal is choice, to stand in a rage losing, we are losing our democracy. Other people decide what to do with their bodies, is a stand to still until it's pillage and the laws for long. But we choose if the sun is hot, if the tulip withers. We choose if the assault is rifled, if the men come and stink. We choose if the cum is drenching, if the torture is daily. We choose if the land is green and owned. If the hunger are stalkers, are cops with fists, whose stalk is pushing back on lightning, the seasick air as it chooses to purge the soggy wood of the hold and stay the enchained, engorged white men rather than reaching to the chokehold and unscrewing their sockets and filleting their mouth. The water is coming apart under our boats. Silt is useless. The body we submit and stays and refuses to give way. What stood so could get dressed and choose what lingers in order to get home, what crawls in the muck, what washed beneath in seawater. And then I wanted to read a poem by Thalias Moss, which is from The Pyramid of Bone. It's also in a book, the title of which I love, her selected, which is called Wannabe Hoochie Mama Gallery of Reality's Red Dress Code. I love that title so much. Anyway, the poem is called Doubts During Catastrophe, and it has an epigraph from Ezekiel. The hand of the Lord was upon me and set me down in the midst of the valley. It was full of bones. Being in God's hand doesn't mean being in a full house. It means Mother Hubbard being a grave robber, cloaking herself in hood and cape dark as her act. This is what one does when one has dogs to beware of. Dig up the prize begonias, a femur, fibula, a tibia, phalanges. She didn't even love those bones when they walked the earth in her man. All it takes is faith, the size of a mustard seed that makes a real princess toss and turn all night, though it's under 30 mattresses. I've never felt the wedding cake beneath my pillow. The hard slice is now an artifact archaeologist attached to a Jurassic behemoth. No better time to recall. I don't know what happened. I lost you guys. There you are, sorry. Let me back up a little bit, sorry. No better time to recall God's fascination with his image. He put something of himself in every creation. When he was tired, he made lazy idiots. When he had hiccups, he made tumbleweeds. When he needed a twin, he made Adam. And whenever he needed to, he watched Adam seduce Eve. And when once Eve refused, God's eyebrows raised, merged, and flew off, a kara seeking carrion. And then there was wrath. Vengeance is mine, he said. And then there was his seduction of Mary, who had to submit and could not disobey the Lord. If he told her he had not created disobedience, he lied. Now the cyclone spirals above my house. I vow not to go to heaven if that's the only ladder. I chose that poem partly because of the panoply of myths and stories, narratives about the possibility for resurrection, I think. Because, and I suppose it's a little grim maybe that we're beginning with this poem, with my poem, because this feels like a very grim poem in a lot of ways. That, you know, the story of Ezekiel being in that, waking in that desert, in the vision of the Valley of Bones, and asking God, you know, if there's any life left in these bones. So in a way, like the idea is hopeful, but it sort of starts with, I guess it's that notion of like being at the very bottom and kind of starting from the bottom and finding a way to resurrect. Because it feels like that's kind of where we're at right now. There's just so much question about what comes after this, what things look like after November, one way or the other, like what it's going to take to sort of come back from all of this. And, you know, I love this poem for a lot of reasons. I think the doubt in it, the irreverence in it, that she so quickly goes from this biblical myth to the Mother Hubbard, which is also pretty dark, you know, about her dead dog and then coming back home and the dog's like reading the newspapers. That she's like, wait, what just happened, you know? So I don't know, I think I love the poem partly because it doesn't hold on to any specific myth as a resolution or a perfect answer, and in that way kind of challenges the notion of religion. But also it's sort of stubborn in its avowal, you know, like if that's the way to get to heaven, then I'm good. I'm gonna stay that last line, I vow not to go to heaven if that's the only ladder. So yeah, I really love this poem, and that's why I chose it.
Thank you. What strikes
I didn't know if I was supposed to say all that, but
yes, you are.
Oh, okay, good.
What strikes me is that it's such a powerful monologue. And when I was listening to you read it this time, I felt like the first person didn't arrive until the penultimate line of the poem, although she does say, "I've never felt the wedding cake beneath my pillow" in the second stanza. But when sort of, there's such a welter of images that she's really forcing you to see the decay and the destruction all around her. And it's only at the very, very end that she brings in any consideration of herself.
Well, I was wondering, Francine, if you were deliberately avoiding biblical references in your poem, because it seemed to have the cadence of biblical language, but you didn't allude really directly to, especially considering that, you know, the Kanya imagery in it.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I thought about it, but I mean, I think, I have to think about that. Did I avoid the reference? I don't know that I avoided it necessarily. I mean, but there is something, I think when you're talking about the will of a whole people, or the will of a whole, what at that time would have been a race of people, it does feel like a divine question, right? Like you can't suggest, much like I don't think you can suggest, I mean, this is, you know, a bigger question about the question between what society dictates in terms of how a people are able to navigate conflict, difficulty, hardship, socioeconomic struggle, because that is, I think, what we're fighting to suggest is that this is not an issue of laziness or an issue of unwillingness or inability, that something is outside of this. Like there are other forces that are working on our decisions, right? Like it almost does become kind of a divine question, not in the sense of, how do I say this? In terms of the complication. Do you know what I mean? Like it's a very complicated answer to figure out how a people survive any given struggle, right? Like there's things that you can point to socioeconomically, there's things you can point to historically, and I guess like what, you know, Kanye was getting at was there's something bigger than that, there's something more metaphysical than that can somehow be quantified, which feels very problematic. I'll say that. It feels very problematic to suggest that you would know what that is. Do you know what I mean? Like, so maybe that's, I don't, you know, that's just what I was thinking of when you asked me that question. I think it's there. I think the thought about divinity is there, but I don't know that I can explain it or point to it exactly.
Well, that seemed to be the very question that your poem brought up, is do we even have a common language anymore to speak of these things? Do we have common myths? Do we have common idioms?
Right.
I would add to that, and what's so fascinating about Thelsis Moss's poem is the rejection of those common myths, even when we have them, and they're part of our commonplace ways of responding to tragedy. This poem takes up the lyric notion that one has to reject even what is offered, because that's perhaps another trick, another way to pull us back into what is commonplace and what is continual. So the lyric poet is refusing those things that are given, whether those are religion or a society, and the poem is coming face to face with the imperfections of those things. But what I admire also very much about this poem is that it does not reject those things at a satiric pitch only.
Yeah.
It really, in some ways, honor those traditions as it employs them in the poem, particularly the biblical Jeremiad that's being taken up here. So that's really fascinating how the poem can adopt to the language of commonplace things and the language of commonplace thoughts and commonplace religious responses to tragedy, but supersede those. And we could talk endlessly about the line breaks as one way of both paying homage to the things that are given, but breaking away from them, and therefore yielding another space, which is, as the title says, doubt, which is what we all need, especially in times of crisis. A healthy dose of doubt could be our one stay against confusion, as Frost had it. So that's really amazingly brought out in this poem. And thank you, Francine, for bringing it to us. I had not read it before, and it's really been speaking to me, and yeah, it's remarkable.
All right, shall we move on to Dan Chiasson, since the clock is ticking. Dan Chiasson, who is the New Yorker's poetry critic, has somehow simultaneously published 30 pieces in the New York Review of Books since he started writing for us in 2009 on not just poetry, but also music, movies, and fiction. His 4 previous books of poems are The Afterlife of Objects, Natural History, Where's the Moon, There's the Moon, and Bicentennial. And his book of criticism, One Kind of Everything, is a gorgeous and sensitive tour through the last 70 years in American poetry. This month, his 5th book of poems is coming out. The Mat Campers feels like his deepest look yet at what it means to dwell for all of our lives inside of the first person, its drawbacks, its responsibilities, and its awfully doomed attempts to see itself clearly. I'm delighted that we'll be publishing one of the new poems in the review in a coming issue. Chason grew up in Vermont and is the recipient of a Whiting Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He's a professor at Wellesley, and I believe he's dialing in from home in Massachusetts tonight. Hello, Dan.
Hello, Jana. It's really lovely to be here. And Francine, that was extraordinary. I was completely, stunned. I really wish I could keep listening, because it's a pleasure to listen, but it's my turn, so I'm gonna go, I guess. I'm gonna read the last several sections of the title poem of my new book, which is called The Math Campers. This poem has a kind of, YA conceit. It's about a camp for 15-year-old math geniuses who figure out how to hack into time to make the summer endless, because they've all fallen in love with each other, girls and boys and boys and boys and girls and girls. And so I was writing it very aware of the climate emergency. It dates from 2019, and so it lags a little, but I hope it reads okay. So I'll read the last few sections, and then I'm going to read. Well, I'll say what I'm going to do after that. So we pick up the poem with the math campers having figured out how to hack into time and keep the summer going. Now, in the interval between dodgeball and snack, the math campers' back of the envelope equations they must solve to make the summer longer. They've meted out the summer with the math they've done so far. If they want a longer summer, oh, they'll have to practice harder. For every correct answer, one more hour, a furlough from the changing leaves. The daisies cheer from the bleachers, and bumblebees gossip about love. Rationalists will say they failed. Fall came and bulldozed the bees. The daisies saw their heads explode, and parents returned in their SUVs. The raft was dragged to a frozen lawn. The January stars withdrew into relations of their own. Ice strangled the bright yarrow. Blackadder has a restraining order against hyssop. Fucking Psycho arrived in a three-wheeler and did donuts in the meadow. An astronaut unzips his suit and masturbates to the turning Earth, while distant galaxies ejaculate in acid trips of death and birth. First in his class, he spends the day on jacking off and solo chess and writing in his diary, "I left the Earth for fucking this." An organ on the TV Mass plays all day for his company. The wonders of the universe turn into drudgery. The universe, first in its class, elaborates its origin in the enormity of space. Light finds its lost horizon, then vanishes in ecstasy. A dust cyclone undoes the sun and kills our opportunity. The little rover lost its friends. First in his class, he toiled hard upon valedictory remarks for his own graduation. Quote, "My battery is low, it's getting dark." That's the end of the poem by me. And now I'm going to read a poem that I've loved for a very long time. And it has come in depressingly handy over the years as this country just goes through one spasm of violence and injustice and cruelty after another. And it was written by Sir Walter Raleigh, although some say it was written by somebody else in 1592. It's called The Lie. The Lie by Sir Walter Raleigh. Go, soul, the body's guest, upon a thankless errand. Fear not to touch the best, the truth shall be thy warrant. Go, since I needs must die, and give the world the lie. Say to the court, it glows and shines like rotten wood. Say to the church, it shows what's good and doth no good. If church and court reply, then give them both the lie. Tell potentates, they live acting by others' action, not loved unless they give, not strong, but by a faction. If potentates reply, give potentates the lie. Tell men of high condition that manage the estate, their purpose is ambition, their practice only hate. And if they once reply, then give them all the lie. Tell them that brave at most, they beg for more by spending, who in their greatest cost seek nothing but commending. And if they make reply, then give them all the lie. Tell zeal, it wants devotion. Tell love, it is but lust. Tell time, it is but motion. Tell flesh, it is but dust. And wish them not reply, for thou must give the lie. Tell age, it daily wasteth. Tell honor how it alters. Tell beauty how she blasteth. tell favor how it falters. And as they shall reply, give everyone the lie. Tell wit how much it wrangles in tickle points of niceness. Tell wisdom she entangles herself in overwiseness. And when they do reply, straight give them both the lie. Tell physic of her boldness. Tell skill it is pretension. Tell charity of coldness. Tell law it is contention. And as they do reply, so give them still the lie. Tell fortune of her blindness. Tell nature of decay. Tell friendship of unkindness. Tell justice of delay. And if they will reply, then give them all the lie. Tell arts they have no soundness, but vary by esteeming. Tell schools they want profoundness and stand too much on seeming. If arts and schools reply, give arts and schools the lie. Tell faith it's fled the city. Tell how the country erreth. Tell manhood shakes off pity. Tell virtue least preferreth. And if they do reply, spare not to give the lie. So when thou hast, as I commanded thee, done blabbing, although to give the lie deserves a no less than stabbing, stab at thee he that will, no stab the soul can kill. So I won't say too much about that amazing poem, except that it's part screed and part dance, and the way that it shapes its own performance in its own indignation, and seems to build on its own success and its own, the confidence kind of builds with the expression. It just moves me very much. And I don't know, one thing I feel is that we're in this moment and art lags a little. It has to lag, even if it lags only by a few minutes. And I am just in a profound feeling of listening and wondering what the great poems of this era are going to be, what the great books are going to be. We're seeing little flashes from people and advertisements for the future, but we, yeah, anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dan. That was wonderful. It also strikes me that this poem is such a source for other works. Like, it reminds me of Yeats's The Fisherman and Emily Dickinson's My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun. The ending is almost drawn
Absolutely.
straight from it.
Yeah.
Well, it's one of my favorite poems ever since I was a teenager. But one of the striking things that I think now is that it's awfully direct for an Elizabethan poem, don't you think?
It is awfully direct, yeah.
I mean,
it's very teenage. It's very adolescent, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, in the most winning way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's so grim because, I mean, I had always thought of Yeats's The Fisherman as an extremely almost cynical poem, but it ends on this glorious note of optimism and sort of exultation, but there's no release at the end of this poem.
No, not at all.
It's so full of angst, right?
Yeah.
And Dan, you read that so movingly. Thank you. That was really beautiful. I think it was Ginsberg who referred to this poem as heavy metal suffering.
I never heard that.
I never heard that.
He gave a whole reading lecture of this poem. I don't think the lecture is at all that stunning, but it's memorable what he said about the pathos of the poem as a sort of heavy metal suffering. And I think there is certainly a lot of that through this poem. And it's so narrow, and yet it widens out. It makes this monumental survey of a whole society, which I think is extraordinary. But it keeps coming back to small little details. One of my favorite similes in all of poetry is right there in the second stanza. it glows and shines like rotten wood. The way that rotten is dropped in there, and the contrast is so sudden to the sort of idealism that comes before, I think is extraordinary. Yeah, but it sort of goes in line about that Auden line, right? About suffering, because it's a poem full of suffering and bitterness. Because I imagine that, and people have argued that Raleigh wrote this poem while in the tower after being there for several years. And so he was bitter, but apparently he was well treated in the tower, some said. I don't know if you can be well treated before death, impending doom. But there's that angst and bitterness, as you said, Dan, that builds towards the end of the poem, that pushing of tell. Yeah.
I think the thing that strikes me about this poem, or maybe it may just be thinking about it in a very contemporary context, is how much effort goes in, like, you know, it comes from the refrain, but refrain reminds me of how much effort goes into responding to every insult, every injustice, every time something happens. You know, the idea of giving the lie means that you have to call someone to the mat. You have to be the one to tell the truth. You have to be the one to put in that.
Do it over and over and
over again. Yeah. And I couldn't stop thinking about that, particularly the refrain of you know, and if they reply, meaning it's not like you can, you know, say, hey, that's not true, you guys. You know, they're gonna come back.
There's always a reply.
There's always a reply. There's always. It just becomes, you know, so exhausting, which feels very contemporary. I don't know if that's what he was thinking about the reply, but that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
That's fascinating what you're saying, Francine. And it makes me think too how subtly the reply is being changed at each end of each stanza.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a sort of bigger version of this poem, Dan, you might be aware of, in which there are interspersed in the poem apparently verses from who knows who. And so the poem, as you know, people have read it traditionally as a longer piece with answers inset in between these reply.
Right.
And so that's it. And so in a sense that the response, even though it's even though the last line of the poem forms this coda that is consistent, it has to always subtly vary because conditions change each moment.
That's right. No, that's brilliant. And I hearing both of you talk about it, I just realized what corrupt power the reply always has, you know, and there's so much excess of wit and intensity and passion that has to go even to neutralize the most corrupt reply, you know, and anyway, that's powerful about the poem.
It's unfortunate that it's a poem for our times. I think we should, whoopsies, my computer just went.
I did that too. I don't think it does anything though. I think it just.
I'm back.
You never left. You didn't leave the.
I know, you guys are back.
Oh, I did. That happened to me too. Like everybody went away.
We should move along because time is passing. But that was wonderful. Thank you. We should move along to Angie.
Okay.
Angie Mlinko is a poet of exquisite music and great wit who often comes back to the problem, which is both an aesthetic and a moral one, of being a maker, a writer who conjures a special kind of language through sound and pattern. In Mlinko's poems, this question builds into a kind of dazzling diorama of sound and image. The sensuous quality of her work is the more remarkable given its range of reference and sheer analytical trenchancy, and its sense of humor, which I think always betrays a poet's connection to something like the real human predicament. She's the author of 5 books of poems: Mcneese, Starred Wire, which won a National Poetry Series award and was a finalist for the James Laughlin Award, Shoulder Season, Marvelous Things Overheard, and her latest, Distant Mandate. She's also a deep and incisive writer on poetry, a winner of the Randall Jarrell Award in criticism, and she has published 7 pieces in the review just in the last couple of years, as well as her own poetry. And we have another Mlinko poem waiting in the wings right now. She's received a Guggenheim Fellowship and is a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Florida, where she is poetry editor of the great journal Subtropics. And I think she's calling in from Gainesville tonight. Hi, Angie.
Hi, Jana. Thank you so much for that introduction. I don't usually respond directly to world events, but I did write a poem on our last election day while I was in an airplane, as a matter of fact. It's called Days, this is an excerpt from Days of 2016, and it borrows the form of its title from the great Greek poet Kavafi. So it takes the form of a letter to a friend who was also on an airplane that day. And it even references viruses, since Zika is in the air at the time. So, part 1. In Miami, Ave Marias are pending. A prayer, a charm, a petition, a mother-to-daughter transmission. Blessed be the fruit of thy womb. Female mosquitoes are sending a virus through uterus and skull, reviving the old rhyme with tomb, rendering baby's brain pan null. My first thought is selfish. Thank God I'm past all that. The worries, the growing fat, on no Chateauneuf de Pape, on no raw brie or shellfish. The lost pyramids of Puy de Mer. With pleasure we served ourselves up to be denied or given a scare. Rain scratches across my vision, utter loss of indemnity, open cisterns breeding calamity. Then I think of something worse. The sun bleaching all petition, all condolence, the papier de Bible rustle of leaves without verse, bark without epistle. 2. Can I glance away from the megalopolis, its neuronal shape tapering into the hard luck rural? Look at this. A dwarf sun sits on our wing, which catches it at a jaunty angle, like an elbow catching an eagle, a shrunken sun king. Yes, I think of dormant viruses waking up in the air day after the election, knowing you, my friend, are also taking off into the blue. Over DC, can you believe? Of course you can. A little turbulence just began, as if to shake us free. Chesapeake inlets look like fingers, steamed crabs, dead man's fingers, as they called the inedible lungs back in the day. Lighting in these aisles was lustre, the yellow of nicotine. Here, ice blue LEDs are clean, but hard on the retinas. Passing over Appalachia, it's unclear those ancient puckers of ground below our elevations. Attached to the window, a hair, not mine. It's not a leap to think of some traveler's head askew, exchanging the privilege of a view for that of sleep. But the Rumpelstiltskin that stirs slithers into the lowlands of the Carolinas. The lakes that gather in the savannas are the color of turtle soup. Lures include false myrtle, frozen charlotte. Soon I'll touch down where you cast an absentee ballot. I pair that with another letter poem. It's called Letters to a Roman Friend by Joseph Brodsky. I won't read the whole thing, I'll just read some excerpts. It's not my favorite Brodsky poem, but it succinctly captures a certain tone and epigrammatic flair that traces back to the Latin poets Horace, Martial, Ovid. and their political and social satires. Posthumous, I'm sending books, I hope you'll like them. How's imperial Rome? A soft bed, hard to sleep on? How fares Caesar? What's he up to? Still intriguing? Still intriguing, probably, and overeating. Birds aren't very bright, my Posthumous, that's certain, but there's misery enough even for bird brains. If one's fated to be born in Caesar's empire, let him live aloof, provincial, by the seashore. Here we've spent, I swear it, more than half our lifetimes. As a slave, now white-haired, told me near the tavern, when we look around us, all we see is ruins. A barbarian perspective, though a true one. I'm back from the mountains carrying fresh wildflowers. I'll get out a jug and fill it with cool water. What's the latest from that Libya or wherever? Are we still engaged in all that desert fighting? Come and visit me and we'll drink wine together. Plums are ripe and bread is good. You'll bring the gossip. I shall make your couch up in the star-swept garden and teach you to name our local constellations. Soon, dear Posthumous, your friend who loves addition will pay off his debt, his old debt, to subtraction. Take my savings then from underneath my pillow. Though not much, they'll pay the cost of my interment. Post on your black mare to the house of Heteras, hard against the wall of our provincial city. Give each girl the sum for which she once embraced me. Let them mourn me for the same amount of money. I definitely wanted something that did not lean on melancholy. I had thought of an excerpt from, say, Louis Mcneese's Autumn Journals, which is a profound poem from 1938, a moment of crisis if there was any. But I did want something more bracing, more mocking, more cutting for these times.
First of all, your own poem was so fantastic. So thank you. I just noted the moment in the Brodsky where the word intriguing is made into a verb, sort of retroactively by the word overeating, the parallelism. So intriguing is to be engaged in the process of creating intrigue. It just reminded me of what it's like to have your life in the hands of a complete buffoon, just an utter clown. And I don't know if you thought of the Caesar of that poem in light of our current leadership, but that's what I thought of.
How could I not? I forgot to mention that he says, if one's fated to be born in Caesar's empire, oh no, I said that. But what in the next stanza, you may say that local governors are vultures. I for one prefer a vulture to a vampire. So how could you not think of that?
It's completely my favorite line.
Yeah.
So I was thinking of outward versus covert. Vampires are pretty sneaky. You don't know a vampire until they strike. But you know the vultures.
I find this poem so moving too, even though it's kind of very satiric and funny, and not taking things. One of the ways in which the humor comes through is just by the name of the person being addressed, posthumous. So, I don't know when Brodsky wrote this, or it is there, 1972. But I suppose every age calls for its own cynicism. But this one works that cynicism with such, for lack of a better term, humanity, and it's rich, and it has the humaneness of friends talking, which I think is important as much as the politics is so daunting. I think what keeps us from falling into even more cynicism is things like this, but conversations with friends, communications, and so on. So I like that the poem really upholds that aspect of our shared humanity that in one sense cannot be destroyed by any Caesar. So that is a note of hope that I think the poem sort of intrinsically holds in the mere form, the letter form, which I think your poem, Angie, how it landing, as much as that final image is, perhaps full of doubt. Who knows where this ballot of the friend might end up and what that ballot might decide for the rest of us. But nonetheless, the fact that the friend is being addressed, I think, lends a sense of hope in a time of dire hopelessness.
Couldn't have put it better. That's exactly what I was thinking, hoping.
Yeah.
You know, at the risk of being, I don't know, a little contentious, but maybe I could frame it the right way, because I mean, what I have been struggling with is I struggle with irony, partly because, you know, that section that you read, it's the whole section 6. Here we've spent, I swear it, more than half a lifetime, and there's the couple lines in there. As a slave now white-haired told me near the tavern, when we look around us, all we see is ruins. A barbarian perspective, though, is a true one. And I, when I first read it, I was like, wait, what's happening? And the thing about irony, that it's particularly true now, that there are so many instances where we're presented with irony and we can't tell anymore, I think. And it's sort of, you know, it returns to the modest proposal, which, you know, apparently when it was first introduced, people were like, is this real? You know, but, and I think that there's been maybe a precious and privileged span of time where we could recognize irony. And we're in a moment again where I can't always tell when you know, like I never thought Colbert was real, but, you know, there are Onion articles that come out that I'm like, wait, is this really happening? So the line, what's the latest from that Libya or whatever? I was like, you know, somebody
Fighting in desert places.
Saying that now, you know, so it's interesting that we're returning to a moment where irony is both effective, but also partly problematic because it's so effective. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I was struggling with this poem a little bit. It was making me feel a kind of way, as they say. Aisha, what were you gonna say?
I agree with what you're saying there, and but I was just looking back at the poem and seeing that there's a sense of realism. It actually rejects whatever kind of sentimentality that can come out of irony, oftentimes, because this is a Roman citizen. This is an inheritor of Rome that is speaking, and probably is fully in defense of Rome. So I think there's that honesty that the speaker is speaking from that position of being a Roman citizen who has benefited from being a citizen of Rome. And there are certain ways to read the slave's remark. As a slave, now white-haired, told me near the tavern. I think that parenthetical note, now white-haired, sort of fixes the slave in a certain way. We have to then think about the fact that this is a very old slave, right? someone perhaps worn down by the system, and so on. So that imagery stuck out to me, and the way that imagery is presented in the parenthetical, almost as a toss-off, really. But it's also slightly protected by the two things barring it in. So it's also important. I think for me, it strikes a more interesting note than what the slave actually said. So the slave actually said something that can be taken as cynical, but the way in which the slave is described is very tender and touching, and we see that this is someone who has lived through and has survived up to this point of oppression. Yeah.
But I have to say, I think the speaker is speaking from exile.
From exile. Okay.
So there's that layer to it as well, because he's far from the center. The whole point, I think, is that there's distance that's been put between him and the center, where Caesar is. And
once you're outside of the center, you're a barbarian?
Well, you're among the barbarians, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's a pastiche not only of Horace and Martial, but also Ovid, who, of course, was exiled at the end of his life and wrote pleading letters back to the center to be let back in.
And a whole pleading poem.
Yeah.
I think it's also interesting to mark our own resistance to the irony of this poem, because I think irony was a huge preserve of that generation of Eastern Bloc poets. It was really their greatest defensive weapon, I think, and they created a whole sort of canon of ironic literature. And it's very interesting to me that we find ourselves feeling that there is a kind of sentimental luxury to it almost in certain lines, but I think we should move on again. I'm sorry. I think we need to move on. That was wonderful.
The conversation is so abbreviated. We could do this.
I know, we should turn this into a seminar.
Podcast.
Now you're talking. All right, let's carry on to Ishion. Ishion Hutchinson is the author of 2 books of poems, Far District, which received the PEN Joyce Osterweil Award, and House of Lords and Commons, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry. As he writes in one poem from his latest book, history is dismantled music, and in a sense his work constantly plays between these two poles. His poems forge an intricately textured music from the landscapes of his native Jamaica and from the rest of the colonized and colonializing world, going back to the city of Rome. These places are reconstituted through the eyes of his subjects and made new through a kind of collaging of perspectives. Hutchinson has received a Whiting Award in Poetry, a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Joseph Brodsky Rome Prize, an award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Wyndham Campbell Prize. We were honored to publish his poem David in the review last December, and we'll have another one coming up before long. He was born in Port Antonio, Jamaica, and is an associate professor of English and the director of the creative writing program at Cornell University. So I think he joins Dan and me in the Northeast tonight. Hi again, Ishion.
Hi. Yes, that's right. From the Northeast corridor. Thank you. And very pleased to be here, and I'm very much enjoying our conversation. The first poem I'll read is one of my own, and it's called Black Space. It's for a Jamaican writer. Her name is Erna Brodber, and I would encourage everybody to, at the end of this, to go and find Erna Brodber's work. She's one of the great Jamaican writers of our time, still very much active and doing wonderful stuff. She has a space in her hometown in the eastern part of the island where I am from. She lives just northeast of where I grew up in a place called St. Mary. And she has this community that she has built and a home that she has built called Black Space. And it's a space where creatives can go and spend time and use as a kind of a retreat. but more than that, it's a space that Brodber is by training a historian and a sociologist, and she has sort of recovered the histories of that space and housed it in that home. So many texts that she has written can be found there. And this poem sort of grew out of an occasion of visiting that space many years ago. And so it's dedicated to her. And it has an epigraph by Richard Crawshaw. Black space, be ye my fictions, but her story. I can bring a halo into the night cave, quiet with music. Do not ask the music, to her shaded there in the moon. Her fine spectacles steam their pawn rings. Her animal eyes fix on the lintel of the door as the wax owl glances back at me. I am her little cotton tree. The breeze combs white into a final note. Her diminuendo, poco a poco. Moon afro, myself outpaces me in wonder of her. She goes off and I seep under the black sprout of her house to rise a salmon bell on the hill, dissolving mile cloud fractals without grief or malice. And the poem that I've chosen to read as we sort of climb down Mount Olympus from my poem and go to the top of it with this poem by the poet Robert Hayden. A poem called The Ballad of Nat Turner. I'll say a little bit about my choosing of it after reading it. The Ballad of Nat Turner. Then fled, O brethren, the wicked Juba, and wandered far from curfew joys in the dismal night. Full of St. Elmo's fire, in scary night I wandered, praying, Lord God, my harshener, speak to me now, or let me die. Speak, Lord, to this mourner. And came at length to livid trees where Ibu warriors hung shadowless, turning in wind that moaned like Africa. Their bell-tongued bodies dead, their eyes alive with the anger deep in my own heart. Is this the sign forepromised me? The spirits vanished. Afraid and lonely, I wandered on in blackness. Speak to me now, or let me die. Die, whispered the blackness. And while things gasped and scuffled in the night, seething shapes of evil frolicked upon the air, I reeled with prayer. I prayed. Sudden brightness clove the praying darkness, brightness that was itself a golden darkness, brightness so bright that it was darkness. And there were angels, their faces hidden from me, angels at war with one another, angels in dazzling combat, and oh, the splendor, the fearful splendor of that warring. Hide me, I cried to rock and bramble. Hide me, the rock, the bramble cried. How tell you of that holy battle? The shock of wing on wing, and sword with the tumult of the taken city burning. I cannot say how long they strove For the wheel in a turning wheel, which is time in eternity had seized its whirling, and owl and moccasin, panther and nameless beast and I were like held creatures fixed in flaming, in fiery amber. But I saw how many of those mighty wings beams waver and fall, go streaking down into swamp water. And the water hissed and steamed and bubbled and locked, shuddering over the fallen, and soon was motionless. Then that massive light began a folding slowly in upon itself. And I beheld the conqueror faces, and lo, they were like mine. I saw they were like mine, and in joy and terror wept, praising Jehovah. Oh, praise my honor, Hoshner, till a sleep came over me, a sleep heavy as death. And when I woke at last free and purified, I rose and prayed and returned after a time to the blazing fields, to the humbleness, and bided my time. So that's Hayden's Nat Turner, a poem that appears in his first collection called A Ballad of Remembrance. And it's a poem I return to so often, clearly because of the power of its making. But it's one of those poems that always feels so timely in its timelessness, and seems to always contain some of what it means to live in an America that is constantly in revolution, whether or not that revolution is on the national scale or, you know, or unfolding in other places in other ways at different temperature. And one of the things that I find so fascinating about this poem, among many, is it does not take up the action of Nat Turner's revolt. It happens. This poem is the vision of the revolt. So what the possibilities that might come out of revolutionary actions is what is being awakened to in this poem. And so the violence of what a revolution might contain is not itself registered in the blood and terror, but it is certainly dreamt up and seen within the vision, and it frightens this revolutionary. And even though obviously Nat Turner did go and undertook this act of rebellion, I think at which, you know, as we know historically, the rebellion, it caused such violence, but did not itself led to emancipation, right? But the way in which this revolution had to have happened, but when we come to the very last line of this poem, which I had usually thought of as profoundly sad and melancholy, that the speaker returns to what he calls the blazing field, and then ending with that very final line, and bided my time. I thought there was a note of defeat there. But the more I have sort of lived in America, I can see that this biding of time is always something that we're coming up to. That is, if we consider all the things that have been happening in recent months, for instance, it's as if the speaker, through that sort of prophetic visionary dreaming, has foreseen this moment as a revolutionary moment. So the revolution that was undertaken by Turner himself was just only a stage in revolution. So Turner's revolution is playing out within our contemporary moment. So that's why I thought of this poem as something I would read and share, and for us to perhaps talk about and see if whether or not my notion of the idea of the revolution, not as delayed, but you know, it's as if we're always writing the disaster, so to speak, and that this is a moment of reckoning that this poem somehow has foreseen and helps us to think through what is happening now.
So glad you did this poem.
It's amazing.
You know, the whole thing that I kept thinking about when you share this poem, because y'all in the audience that don't know this, we saw the poem before we got here. Maybe that's a spoiler alert, I don't know, anyway. But I kept thinking about, you know, Kerry James Marshall has a painting of, I think it's called The Portrait of Nat Turner with the head of his white master, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's the title. Anyway, it's a painting of Nat Turner's in the foreground, and in the background, there's just a white bed. And so, you know, Kerry James Marshall's, it's kind of signature that Nat Turner's image is gray and his face is black, and the background, like the bed is white, and the slave master's head is in the bed and it's white. Everything's very white in the background. But I was thinking about that painting for two reasons. One, because it's so peaceful. Like there's actually no terror. Like the bell-tongued body in this poem belongs to Africans, not to white folks. And I was thinking about that painting because even in the viciousness of that scene, the slave master's head, like his eyes are, it looks like he's sleeping. He just doesn't have, he's just disembodied, you know? And what's interesting to me about that painting is where I saw it. It was at the Met Brewer during a Kerry James Marshall retrospective. And it was in the back, all the way in the back, like the very back gallery. And it just, you know, the story of Nat Turner is still taboo. Like it's still a risky story to tell. It's still a risky endeavor to depict the death of white people, even as slave masters. Like that's what I kept thinking about in reading this poem, you know, like, because it sort of enacts that in a way too. Maybe it had to for Hayden, you know?
Yes.
What struck me about it here was how, hearing it out loud, it's a poem of such linguistic force. But at first glance on the page, it's in ballad form, right? It's in the this traditional looking ballad form, traditional form for storytelling. But it clearly spills over the container at every point. So it both partakes of this storytelling tradition, you know, that goes back to as old as our country is, and then it has this incredibly dithyrambic, you know, too muchness, excess to it. That's where the revolutionary energy can't be contained by the form. Kind of fascinating.
Yeah, and I just to pick up on that, I noted, as Angie says, there's a kind of narrative stateliness on the page, but to hear you read it aloud, the echoing phrases, which seem to me anyway, to accelerate as the poem goes forward, hide me, wheel, blackness, which just is stunning. They seem to be cropping up more and more as the poem goes forward. I could be wrong about that, but there's some sort of feeling of acceleration or elation or panic or some heightening of the narrative calm that the poem, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree, Dan. In fact, it's sort of like a dark night of the soul kind of poem. We're getting into a psychological horror here. You know, it's like Dante's visionary dream. So it's insane. You know, on one hand, it's a poem of pilgrimage that this landscape of the Southampton, Virginia, is so vividly given. The swamps and so on, the descriptions, but we're getting into the psychology of what it means to be an object and an abject person, and what kind of mental, what did Blake call it? Mental fight it takes to retain one's humanity in light of such a erasing force. You know, so the violence, like the violence of physically, how do you physically destroy slavery, right? That's a question at root of this poem, and I think the answer is given on one hand, that possibility will just lead to, as the poem says, sword and sword, and so on and so forth. If one can physically destroy slavery, has one freed oneself from being a slave, right? How do then does one perpetuate that position of subjugation? And it's difficult to answer such a question. And when the poem comes near towards its end, it says, I beheld the conqueror faces, and lo, they were like mine. I saw they were like mine, and in joy and terror wept, praising Jehovah.
It felt so Baldwin-ish to me, that line.
Yes. Oh yeah, because of the jeremiad of taking on a biblical language and seeing it from the other end, right? And that's a really tough, I don't know, a difficult creative act for a poet to pull off. You know, we're back to like you know, that phrase in that sonnet by Tolson, I think, to make a poet black and sing. Am I recalling?
But also I was thinking beheld the conqueror faces, and lo, they were like mine, reminds me of the ways in which Baldwin liked to remind people that the oppressor is actually the one whose soul is most oppressed. You know what I mean? Like, that line felt to me as kind of an inversion, a spiritual inversion, you know?
Yes, yes.
It also seems, as far as I know, that stanza in the poem struck me as one of the most powerful moments. And as far as I know, that's one of the sort of fictional inventions of the poem, right? Because I think in the Confessions of Nat Turner, the poem does slot into the history of Nat Turner quite accurately. But as far as I know, he never says that these visions he had made him realize that he was explicitly on the side of the conquering angels. He saw dark and light fighting, but he didn't. I don't think he ever comes out and says that in the Confessions anyway. And I found it very powerful that in the poem, Hayden takes the extra step of showing how identifying with these visions that he had is largely what gave him the power to go forward, that it sort of gave him the faith in the whole project.
That's so fascinating what you're saying, Jana, because it takes me back to what Dan, when Dan read the Raleigh poem, right? And, you know, if we think of say even Keats talking about the lyric excess, that or Sakaiva saying that the lyric is already too much. The poet has to somehow push the poem to breaking point, and not break. It's you know, it's very physically, even reading a poem like that, you do feel the whole body being stretched, right? And so, but it's necessary for the lyric to go up to that heightened position and go beyond even what is physically possible to something else, whatever we want to call it, grace, whatever. But I find it exhilarating that this poem reaches that pitch of overriding, say, even the ballad form with its, you know, its ready-made shape. It does that by, for instance, having those off rhymes going throughout, and at times not rhyming at all. What do we call blackness rhyming with blackness in one of those stanzas, right? So it's again back to that sort of terror of dealing with a position that one is a non-entity. One lives a kind of social death already. How do I get recognition out of this position?
That was also just an incredibly powerful reading. Thank you. I again fear that we've sort of doubly overshot our time. And we did say that we would take some questions, but I feel like we should take one and say goodnight. I also have a 4-year-old whose room I'm sort of keeping off limits right now.
I mean, the question wisely, yeah.
What's that?
You have to choose the question wisely.
I will try. What can I say? There was one here that really caught my eye, and I thought we could chew it over for a second. One of my favorite poets. This is Alexander Guevara's, I believe, although my eyesight is not great. Sorry. One of my favorite poets, James Merrill, felt that a topical or political poem didn't engage the whole personality, only the part that was fearful or outraged, so that if one cried aloud to be written, he would try to keep it as brief as possible. Thoughts?
Wait, what was say the last thing? Is this a quote from Merrill, or is he paraphrasing?
It's a paraphrase. That a topical or political poem didn't engage the whole personality, only the part that was fearful or outraged. And so if he felt he had to write one, he'd keep it brief.
I love Merrill, but I think it slights his own work, which is extremely political. But his persona was perhaps apolitical or post-political, but I think we can't trust his own judgment there.
I mean, you know, I feel like, is this a question? I'm not sure if this is a question or just a general thought, but I have thoughts about the thought. And my thought about it is that it's kind of a double-edged sword, what's being proposed. Because, you know, there's a part of me that thinks, yeah, like righteous indignation is a little narrowly focused and probably a little disingenuous to some extent, because, you know, you can always be mad at somebody else, right? But then there's another part of me that thinks, well, any focused emotion will do exactly the same thing that you're saying. It doesn't matter what the emotion is the minute that you focus that lens, you're removing all other possibility for an emotional response or an emotional reaction. Anger and rage and righteous indignation is as valid a response as anything else. You know what I mean? So I don't know that it really matters what the lens is. but there is a part of me that is always interested in self-implication and thinking about where we fall into the larger picture, you know? There seems to be a little bit in that if you just get mad and you don't sort of like think of the holistic response, then I suppose it can kind of do what Meryl's, Alexander is saying that Meryl's saying.
Good brief. I mean, if we think of Paradise Lost, that wasn't kept brief at all, and right. It's a mighty political poem. But I think we have to understand what it is that we mean, or that we're trying to imply by the word political.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other thing, right? So
right.
Big.
Right. Yeah.
It's so funny. I was thinking that Milton underlies both of your poems, the poems that you read, Francine and Ishion. There are such Miltonic images in both the Thylias Moss and the Robert Hayden poem.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And yeah, I'm still always, because that question comes up so often about, you know, the poet's relation to politics or the political. I think if one is talking about writing poems cheering on the Republican or the Democratic Party, that's one idea of politics, of the political, that I think the poet should definitely keep brief or not do at all. You know, but it's the poet's right, of course, to do that kind of political service. You know, how far it will get, who knows, you know. But of course, the other political that I think Francine is hinting at is, and that one always, in a sense, carries, I think, what you're calling the self-implication, wherein language is always forcing us to reckon with our complicities, whether or not we are conscious of them or not. You know, I think a great poem is always, politics is embedded within it, because it takes up language, and language is a political animal.
I think we can make the distinction that there's occasional poetry, right? So if you write a poem on the occasion of someone's birthday or the occasion of a political event, those are rather limiting themes, right?
Yeah.
So it's helpful to think of the political as something that weaves through one's work. And if you have a fine antenna, then of course you're going to pick up on those issues. But rather than make an occasional poem on an occasion of this or that, it sort of gets diffused through your work.
I just want us to be. I can't wait till the day that we admit that all poems are political. Like it's just how I think about it. I don't think there's any avoidance of, because the world is happening outside of us, and it doesn't matter whether we pretend like it's not there or not. It comes through. It's always there. It's always in our perspective. So in that sense, I guess it's true. It's always filtering out all of the stuff that, you know, we don't want to present on the page about our humanity, whether we choose to or not. You know, we betray ourselves.
The personal lyric is political. I think everyone agrees with that, right? I think that's not even a controversial statement.
I know. It always seems to come up.
Perhaps we should, sorry, Dan.
Oh, that can be really brief. I know there's that thing in Yeats where he says, "Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when will it suffice?" You know, and I do feel that within highly political poets like Yeats, there's often an open wondering about oh man, maybe my personality is changing. maybe I'm becoming some distillate or erasure of myself because of the pitch at which I'm fighting. So anyway, that's all I'll say.
Well, I'm back on screen, which marks the end of the event. The least interesting person always has to come back. Thank you so much to our panel. That was an absolutely terrific evening. I will be sending you guys contracts for the podcast. And then otherwise, you know, we should really do this again. I'll note that I did post links to purchase everyone's newest collection in the chat. If anyone wants to take the last 5 seconds while I talk to go find those and click on them, please do so. Otherwise, I want to thank our friends at the New York Review for helping us put this together. We will, as I mentioned at the start of the program, we're going to be continuing this panel series throughout the fall and into the spring. So please do follow both of our newsletters to find out when that next iteration is going to happen. Otherwise, to our panel, thank you guys so much. This was absolutely wonderful. The feedback we've been getting from the chat reflects just the same. And I want everybody to have a great night. Be safe, be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.